Meta is short for metagame. No, really, that's it. It's not an acronym for most effective tactic available. Please stop saying that. With that being said though, the term meta is inherently tied to concepts like strongest and optimal, although it's wrong to call them real synonyms of each other. They're closely linked but not the same, although to be fair, using them interchangeably will probably be fine for the average discussion. But whatever. But Mr. 9 subscriber internet man, what does metagame even mean then? Why do people think it means what you say it doesn't? Gee, I wonder what the rest of this video is about, huh? I think the best way to understand the concept of a metagame is through card games, especially since it was Magic the Gathering that popularized the term as far as I can tell. Basically, think of it like this. You're heading to a local tournament for your favorite TCG. It's not super high stakes, but you'd really like to win for whatever reason. Bragging rights, a $3 prize reward, really doesn't matter. So what would be your first course of action? Well, you'd probably want to bring a deck that'd make you most likely to beat everyone else, right? So how do you do that? You'd want to know which kinds of decks everyone else is going to bring so you know how to beat them, right? So you probably hop onto the internet and you look up strongest TCG decks and you start looking. Oh hey, there was this big tournament last week and the top 5 played these decks. Here's some social media posts analyzing a bunch of those tournament decks. Maybe to discuss some hypothetical counters that have good matchups into them. Here's a piloting guide for this new budget deck that's been seeing a lot of community popularity. Now it's up to you to try and guess how everyone else will play at the local tournament and bring the best deck you can for those specific circumstances. Congrats! You just studied a metagame and tried to make the best decision you could based off of that information. AKA, you just participated in a meta. This sort of activity is at the heart of what a meta is. You figure out current trends in the player base and adapt, whether that be by adapting someone else's strategy because you believe it to be good, creating your own strategy to counter the strategies you think you'll face, or modifying your existing strategy to do better into what's popular. So, in the loosest sense, meta just refers to how players play a game and how they change how they play based on how others play the game as well. Thanks to the rise of internet tools and a larger interest in competitive sides of games, think esports, metagames are just now a much more prominent part of gaming as a whole. This idea of a meta is particularly relevant in games that inherently lead to matchup spreads. So, fighting games, you pick a character and that character does well into some characters and worse into others. Card games, as mentioned before, good and bad matchups for decks. But a meta can also be about strategies as a whole. Think like Valorant or CSGO, I guess it's CS2 now. CS2 buying patterns. Metas are about common trends, and that trend can be about anything from which characters are the most popular to, well, the specifics of how people approach each match. You might have noticed that in part 1, I tried to avoid ever directly talking about the quote-unquote strength of anything. Seems a bit strange, doesn't it? I mean, even I said so in the intro. Don't most people use the word meta to refer to dominant strategies or what's currently considered the strongest? So what's up with that? Here's the big catch for this kind of stuff. Things are often the meta because they are considered strong, but being strong doesn't inherently make you meta. Let's dive a bit deeper into this idea. Think of it like this. Why are things meta? Well, in PvP games, most people want to win, right? Which means that most people play in a way that they think will make them win more. Therefore, popular things will be what people consider to be strong. And especially with the rise in, competitive games and a bunch of the stuff I talked about before, people have access to a lot more resources on how to improve and also what's considered meta. Pro play or content creators or, even websites that have like win rates and pick rates and ban rates and all that. However, this is also where the concept of meta starts to diverge from pure strength. And the game I'm going to use an example from here on out is going to be League of Legends? For the average player who's serious about League, they're probably playing ranked solo or duo. This is immediately different from something like pro play, where each side is made up of people who know each other, actively play and practice together, and also have voice chat for better comms. They also probably have much more on the line than just a rank. This is a career for them. They aren't trying to OTP Garen mid to challenger or something, they're doing whatever they think will maximize their chances of winning. Pros are inherently playing in a different environment from the average player, which means that the pro play meta is different from the ranked meta. This is most evident through the idea of pro jail, or champions that are considered underpowered by the general community but can't be buffed because those champions have characteristics that pro players value highly, and so often have major weaknesses to compensate. In ranked, team coordination is not the greatest, and so these champs can struggle to actually utilize their strengths to create an advantage, while having their team help compensate for their weaknesses. But in pro play, that isn't true. Pros are better at making sacrifices for their teammates during their weak points, think stuff like lane swaps, and generally avoiding risk. Think about how solo kills are generally much less likely in pro play. This isn't even getting to the idea of low elo or high elo skewed champions. Some champions are infamous for having much higher win rates at lower ranks while falling off at higher ranks, while other champions have higher win rates at higher ranks, but lower win rates at lower ranks, something that tends to be reflected in the pick rates of those champs in those ranks. For example, Amumu is considered a pretty simple jungler, who is better at lower elos thanks to his linear and simple game plan, which makes him often recommended as a jungler to beginners. According to LoLalytics, in Bronze, he has about a 52% win rate, about 3% higher than their expected Bronze win rate of 49%. However, in Masters, despite still having about a 52% win rate, the expected Master Elo win rate is actually about 53.5%, meaning that Amumu is underperforming there. In Grandmaster and Challenger, his win rate falls even further behind the expected win rates of players at that rank. This is also shown by Amumu's pick rates. In Bronze, he has a 7.5% pick rate, pretty high, but in Masters, he has a 1.42% pick rate, noticeably smaller. Therefore, I could argue that Amumu is a part of the low elo meta for junglers. He has a pretty high pick rate and a higher than expected win rate, but in higher elos, both his win rate and pick rate go down. Therefore, he isn't meta in higher elos because he's not picked as much and perceived as less viable, and statistically, that seems to be true. So even within just normal ranked games of League, different ranks can have very different metas. If you're an Iron player, you shouldn't be expecting that many Rek'Sai jungles, since he has a 1.54% pick rate in Iron. Conversely, someone like Warwick has a whopping 17.8% pick rate in Iron, so you're probably gonna see a lot of Warwick in your games. There are junglers considered better by higher elo players. But in Iron, that doesn't change the fact that Warwick is the jungler you are most likely to encounter, and therefore one you should probably think about more compared to other jungle picks. But in a higher rank like Emerald, Warwick's pick rate drops to 6.76%, still pretty popular, but now there are junglers you're going to encounter much more often than Warwick. So this means that what's meta and what's optimal for a player is already based on the context in which they play. While pro play might be gameplay at the highest level of League of Legends, it also facilitates a unique environment that differs from the norm that most players experience. There are picks in pro play that work better there but often don't see as much success in normal play. But even in normal play, the rank you are playing at has a different meta and a different set of strong picks compared to the ranks above and below you. But this isn't even getting into the subjective nature of a meta. Something else I want to mention from the pro jail thing is that there are pro play champs that are picked because of comfort, not necessarily just strength. For example, in 2024's Worlds, oh hey, it's 2025 now, Corki got nerfed in the Worlds patch, aka the patch that the Worlds tournament is going to be played on. And Riot explicitly stated that this nerf was primarily to try and get pros to stop playing him, like completely, and therefore shake up the meta because he was a comfort pick in mid even though he wasn't really strong after a series of direct and indirect nerfs. Corki had remained in the pro meta despite being targeted with nerfs, because of reasons beyond just quote-unquote objective strength. I mean, just look at the reasons that Riot gave in the patch notes that had the Corki nerf. They explicitly mentioned that at this point Corki had been nerfed enough that pro players were dropping him, but they wanted to just completely make sure that he wouldn't show up at Worlds in mid lane. I'm not trying to argue that pro players are like playing things purely off of like what they enjoy playing. Obviously, even this nerf I'm showing off shows the opposite. Pro players are willing to drop a champion if they are considered weak enough. But at the same time, the fact that Riot was afraid that Corki might show back up if they didn't take this preemptive nerf is also an indicator that even if Corki wasn't as strong as he used to be, that there was still a chance that mid laners would want to play Corki because that was a champ that they had a lot of experience with in mid lane already. Let's start taking a bit of a break from League of Legends, and I'll give another example showing the reverse, or people intentionally avoiding a strong pick for subjective or enjoyment reasons. There's a pretty niche Pokemon singles community format called RBY7U. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically they banned Confuse Ray from the tier despite the fact that no one was actually using Confuse Ray in any sort of competitive play, like tournaments. And this was because that despite the fact that the community knew that Confuse Ray was a good move, no one actually enjoyed playing with or against it, and so there was just this community-wide agreement to just not use the move, even if it was strong. And, the ban was just to cement that. But the point I'm trying to make with this anecdote is that Confuse Ray was not meta despite being acknowledged as strong, because that's not what the players of this niche format liked. Something you might have noticed throughout this video is that I often say something like quote-unquote objective strength. And let's dive deeper into that idea as well. Why do I keep putting objective in quotation marks? Well, it's important to realize that video games are complicated, and a lot of the time, even the best players won't be 100% right. Even skilled players who try to experiment and find out what really are the strongest choices available aren't perfect. They are perfectly capable of passing over things that are strong or overrating something as being better than it really is. Video games are complicated, they're hard. There are a lot of moving parts that makes it hard to, truly and objectively evaluate something from a completely unbiased, completely fair perspective, no matter how hard you try. So remember that metas are founded upon the perception of strength. And obviously, that perception of strength is probably going to come from good players who are doing their best to truly and fairly evaluate the strengths of different options. But it's still possible for them to be wrong. But this also isn't to say that metas are objectively wrong. Further consider that in a lot of games, what's strongest is, in an ironic way, itself dependent on what the meta is. For example, a hypothetical situation I was taught back when I played more TCGs in high school is this hypothetical scenario where you have 3 decks. Deck A is the deck currently considered to be the strongest. Deck B is a deck that counters Deck A. Deck C is a deck that counters Deck B, but loses to Deck A because it's not designed specifically to counter Deck A. So Deck A is currently considered the strongest in the community, and a lot of people play Deck A. So now some people go, oh hey, I'm gonna create Deck B that's specifically designed to counter Deck A. And because a lot of people play Deck A, Deck B is now suddenly doing a really good job. But Deck B is so hyper-focused in defeating Deck A that it loses to a lot of the decks that Deck A normally beats. And so now that Deck B is getting popular, and Deck A is getting less popular, suddenly all those decks that Deck A used to beat are now starting to beat Deck B instead. But now that Deck B is getting beat all the time, Deck A can suddenly return to the meta and start beating all of Deck C. And I think you're starting to get an idea of what's going on here. If you were going to enter a tournament where you knew that everyone was either going to play Deck A, B, or C, Which of the three would you choose to bring to maximize your chances of winning? You'd probably say that it depends on what others are bringing, right? Well, that means that what you consider to be the objectively best choice is dependent on what others bring, not by some sort of objective measurement about the strength of the decks in a vacuum. This section's getting a bit convoluted, and I do wish I could have explained it a bit better. But the point I'm trying to make is that what's meta and what's strong are related, but by no means the same thing. Like, yeah, what's meta is supposed to be what's strong, but what's strong is in itself a complicated question that often depends on the answer to the question, well, what's meta right now? So this whole time I've been talking about PvP multiplayer games. But what about single player games or PvE games? What about those? And that's a good question. And I think the answer to that depends on what you really mean. Usually, meta in a single player game, or PvE game, is used to refer to what's currently considered optimal. And I guess that means my video is for nothing then. All jokes aside, the definition of meta that I've been using up to this point just doesn't really work in my opinion. Like, the whole point I was making was that meta is what's popular, right? And you're gonna face off and play with what's popular, so you gotta learn how to play around that in order to maximize the chances of you winning, and that's the point of a meta. But in a single player game, you're not playing against players, you're playing against the computer, NPCs, AI, whatever else you want to call it. As a result, it doesn't really make sense to talk about metas in a single player game from the perspective of what's popular, because, well, that doesn't really matter anymore. Like, remember in my second part where I talked about how what's strong can itself depend on what's meta? Well, that's not true here. What's strong is simply what's strong, doesn't matter how popular it is. Upon reflecting upon my script for this section, I find I don't like it as much as my other two parts. So I'm going to try to give the best analogy I can to get across my main point for this section, so that if you find you don't enjoy the rest of this part, then you can just skip to the end. Let me use an analogy where you're still competing against someone to show what I mean by the difference in PvP versus PvE competition. Yeah, let's head back to League for a moment. Let's say you're competing against someone in a 1v1, and you know what champ they're gonna pick every single time. Now, for the sake of this hypothetical, you're like about as equally good on all champs, which is, silly, but it's a hypothetical, that's the point. What your best pick is, like I said in my part 2, entirely dependent on what the best counter pick to their champ is, right, in this situation? But now let's say instead of a direct 1v1, the challenge is which one of you can beat an intermediate luck spot in a 1v1 on mid lane first. Now, obviously, there are still good picks and bad picks, but the big point I want to emphasize is that what the other person picks doesn't matter for your own pick anymore. I do want to be clear about this though, like, I'm not saying that you can't look at the other person's pick and go, oh, that's kind of better than mine, I should pick that champ too or something. What I'm trying to get at is, their pick does not make your pick better or worse. It's entirely based on how your picks match up to the intermediate luck spot. And this is the core difference in my eyes between a PvP and a PvE experience in terms of the definition of meta. In a PvP game, both players are making decisions that actively influence the strength of each other's picks. But in a PvE game, all that matters is how your choices stack up to the predetermined static bar of success. Remember my whole thing in part 2 about the objective strength of something being hard to truly grasp, and that strength is in itself dependent on the meta because of the fact that stuff like matchups exist? Well, in single player games, that's just not true. It's much easier to determine objective strength because there's a singular benchmark to pass. Like, in League of Legends again, say I think Caitlyn counterpicks Jhin, and so I start picking Caitlyn against Jhin, and I'm actually doing pretty well into him. But then all of a sudden, Jhin mains are like, hey, you should start Doran's Ring into Caitlyn. and all of a sudden, Jin is now favored into the matchup instead. But in a PvE environment, I don't have to worry about things like that. If I know my strategy works, then I'm pretty confident that my strategy will work all the time from here on out, barring, like balance changes. Anyways, if you've made it this far, I'll probably just start talking about the, how metas form in single player and PvE games then, I guess. So I think there are two categories of meta here. There's like PvE metas and like pseudo PvP metas. So in the first case, think like challenge modes or prominent community made challenges. So like in my mind, I'm thinking of like Pokemon Nuzlocke as the latter, and maybe something like maddening mode in Fire Emblem for the former. I mean, I haven't played like Fire Emblem or anything. My friend played Three Houses, and that's like most of my knowledge, honestly. For other examples, I mean, I don't know, gacha game endgames like Genshin Spiral Abyss or Theater, or, all three of Honkai Star Rail's endgame modes. The point with the stuff baked into the game, like maddening mode and the gacha stuff, those are still like PvE experiences, but they're beyond the scope of what like casual players are probably willing to go for. And so like people are probably gonna look up like, oh, what is the meta for maddening mode or Spiral Abyss, because maybe they're a casual who's struggling and they want to find an answer to like, lower the barrier of execution on their end, or maybe even make the execution possible at all. Which depends on like how high the bar to clear is and the type of game in question and like the expectations on the player and all that. Similarly, like community made challenges like Pokemon Nuzlocke, like, I mean, there's probably still lots of flexibility in what you can do, but like, I'm sure there are people who are going out like, oh, what is the best Pokemon I can catch on X route, you know what I mean? There's also room for like PvP style competition in PvE games, like speedrunning, or more broadly like leaderboard style competitions. Who can beat the game the fastest, who can get the highest score at the end of the run and whatnot. And in this case, there's probably a meta in the sense that like everyone getting the highest scores is using the same strategy, and if you use a different strategy, it's either, not gonna get as high of a score, or it's gonna turn out to be like better than the current meta strategy and form a new meta around it. And in that sense, this is closer to like the traditional idea of a meta, but again, it's like the whole League 1v1 analogy I used at the start of this section, where the benchmark is flat and you compare the best strategies by comparing how they do against that flat benchmark instead of against each other directly. Yeah, can you tell this section isn't as good as I'd like it to be? Well, yeah, here's the end of part 3. Yippee! So there you have it. That's what meta means, probably. Now you can be like me and passive-aggressively make comments on social media the next time you see someone say most effective tactic available and feel vaguely superior to them or something. If you had to take away one thing from this video, I hope it's that you understand that while what's meta is typically also what's strong, a meta and a metagame, it's less a set of like perfectly optimal choices for you, and more so a sort of ecosystem within the game that the players create. It's about how players make decisions and how those decisions influence and affect each other. If you stuck around this long, thank you. Like legitimately, this was a pretty ambitious project for me and something pretty new. And I mean, I can already start to tell there's a lot of stuff I can improve, and like, I'm recording this on my headset microphone, so I'm sure the audio is not incredible and all that. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed watching and maybe learned something. I doubt this video is gonna get that much traction, so you can probably ask me to elaborate on stuff in the comments, and I'll probably get back to you. And yeah, I think I'm obligated to say, like, Like and subscribe because the buttons glow when I do.